Welcome to the University of Missouri's Teaching for Learning Center's AI Critical Literacy podcast. My name is Jared Schroeder. I'm the host of the podcast and an associate professor of journalism at the Missouri School of Journalism. And this episode kicks off season 2. Season 2, episode 1. This is the It's Only Cheating If You Get Caught episode. I've forgotten a lot about high school. Things I probably should have learned that I didn't. And an absurd amount of unnecessary information about the Alamo. It seemed like we covered the Alamo a disproportionately large amount of time. I was in Texas. And it turns out that the Alamo information hasn't been very useful at all in the rest of my life. That's weird, right? But one thing I really do remember, and it's probably, like, I think about it all the time, it's like permanently wedged in my mind, is a moment from high school football. I was an undersized, understrength offensive lineman, and I remember the coaches during two-a-days, these excruciating, hot, long, humid, muggy practices in the summer, with all these pads on. I remember the coach pulling us aside, the offensive line coach, and explaining to us, you're not allowed in football to hold the defender. You can't hold them during the play to keep them from making a tackle or getting to the quarterback or whatever. You can't hold them. You have to block them. You can't hold them. But he explained to us, and you get a penalty if you get caught, right? They'll throw a penalty flag. The offensive line coach explained to us it's only holding if you get caught. And I think about that all the time because what it does is it creates a very specific type set of ethics. I've been thinking about the idea that it's only holding if you get caught lately because I've been thinking so much about AI and the integrity of our courses and the integrity of our teaching. And if you listen to the Teaching for Learning Center at the University of Missouri's AI Critical Literacy podcast last season, you might have seen that I was kind of heading in this direction, that my journey as a teacher has led me to this point where I am just really thinking about how to maintain and enhance the integrity of my courses. And I'm not just, this hopefully isn't selfish, I'm thinking that many of us in this community are thinking about how to adjust our courses, our assessment, our teaching to reach our students in an era where AI has made it so easy for students to skip all the learning parts and just get right to creating a product or an outcome. So welcome to season 2. Welcome to the It's Only Holding If You Get Caught episode of the Teaching for Learning Center's AI Critical Literacy podcast. This is season 2. So season 1, we went through the book. We maintained the same format this season. We went through a specific book. Last season, it was Ethan Mollick's Co-Intelligence. And we went over like a chapter or two every episode, and we had a guest every episode that would bring some kind of special insight to the subject matter of those chapters, and we're going to repeat that same format, including the random intros that I provide with each episode, theme setting, framing intros. And so this is episode 1 of season 2. Our ratings were so high. I'm just kidding. I have no idea what our ratings are. But welcome to season 2. My hope, we don't know the ratings, but my hope continues to be that this podcast is a useful, informative tool. And I love the format that allows people might not have time to get to a book club in person. There's value in that, and there's community building in that. But I love that this format of the podcast allows people to meet them where they are with this thinking. And the podcast isn't really based on telling people what to do. It's about giving people information that will allow them to figure out what to do. Maybe that's just, I'm an associate professor of journalism in the Missouri School of Journalism. Maybe that's just my journalism training. But my hope is this podcast continues to help people be equipped to make the decisions that they need to make for their unique courses, their unique class sizes, their unique teaching and learning objectives. This season, we are looking at the book for this season, if you wanted to get it, is called The Opposite of Cheating. It is by Tricia Bertram-Gallant and David Redinger. And this book is very much focused on, like I was saying, AI critical literacy and assessment and teaching with integrity and creating and making sure that we maintain the integrity of our courses. I very distinctly remember sitting at graduation last spring and watching people shake the dean's hands. I was at my school's graduation, shake the dean's hand and walk across the stage. And I was like, I wonder how many of these students used AI to get through their whole program. And that concerns me because I want what we do to matter. I want to teach. I want to teach. I want my students to learn. I want them to gain. I want them to be equipped for the futures that they are pursuing. So anyway, there's a lot. There's a lot here to think about. So welcome to season 2, episode 1. Episode 1 focuses on why students cheat. And I got the perfect guest for this episode. If you're thinking, he says he has the perfect guest every time, it's because I do, right? I'm just kidding. Like, a very well-suited, potentially perfect guest for this episode. I reached out to Ben Trachtenberg. Ben Trachtenberg is the outgoing associate dean at the Missouri School of Law. But more importantly for this role, he is the director of the university's Office of Academic Integrity. So he's the one who encounters all of these cases about cheating and AI and cheating. And so he has a very unique perspective on this campus about integrity and assessment and AI. He was also one of the chairs of the AI task force from spring 2024. And I was on the task force with him, but I wasn't in his specific group. But his group really focused and talked about exactly what we're focusing on this season. So he's a perfect guest for this. And I would just say, as I'm about to hand it over to him, that there were 3 bullet points I really think came out of that. And that they're really interesting. And as you read, if you were to read the book, and this episode focuses on the introduction in chapter 1, if you were to read the book, this would have more context than I probably have with you right now. The 3 bullet points I really thought about from this discussion with him, and you'll hear them kind of intermixed in, but it's kind of as I've thought about our discussion. 3 things that we can really do to help our students not cheat, to help our students have integrity, and to build classes that have integrity in the AI era are: 1, make it really clear to students why you're giving them the assignment you're giving them. So the argument is that if we explain to our students why we're using this assessment, I probably wouldn't frame it as an assessment, but why we're doing this assignment, that's not busy work, that it has an important connection with what they're trying to learn, that is supposed to help improve the likelihood that they will not cheat and that they will be more integritous and have more integrity. See, I should have learned that word instead of the Alamo every day in school. 2, we need to show our students that we care about their learning and we care about them. Studies show that students who think or believe that their faculty, their instructor, care about their learning or are invested in their learning are more likely to not cheat and are more likely to engage in the way that we hope they will engage in the assignment. Finally, 3, we need to write assignments that are clear when it comes to AI requirements, that make it difficult for students to use AI to cheat, and make it clear how AI can or should be used in the assignment. So you're going to hear these reviewed and in much more context in my discussion with Ben. I'm going to turn it over to him. Hope you enjoy our discussion.
Sure. My name's Ben Trachtenberg, and my regular job is teaching at the law school at the University of Missouri, and my part-time position is director of the Office of Academic Integrity for the campus.
Which is one of the perfect reasons why you're the right person to talk to for this set of chapters. The other thing I was always asking last season, I think I'm going to carry on the tradition, even though I'm not sure if it was good or not, was to always ask the guest, what their first experience with AI was. So what was your first experience with AI?
I don't remember, as funny as that sounds. And part of this is an argument about definitions, right? Which is that we've been interacting with AI for a long time before ChatGPT was a thing and people talking about generative AI, but I might have interacted with AI without knowing it when my computer suggested the next word in a sentence, or for things like grammar check or search engines or things of that nature. And there's all sorts of AI that the computer scientists would say is totally different than the ChatGPT kind of stuff. But in terms of the more recent universe of ChatGPT and Claude and so on, I actually don't remember when I first started seeing it. I think that people started asking me about it in the context of academic integrity, a sort of what are we going to do situation. And I had already heard of it at that point, but not really used it much. And so it may be that my first actual use personally was in response to those questions, but I can't remember.
Yeah, that's fair. You're the only person so far that says I can't remember, but you're right. Like we could have been using it for a long time, and then it's incorporated itself into our lives so quickly and so seamlessly in many ways that it could be hard to remember when that moment was. So had these authors of the book, Had you encountered anything from them before?
I don't believe so.
Okay. The authors Trisha Gallant and David Redinger. So I'm the same way. I just recently started reading this book, but it's like, in many ways, the podcast I feel like is me trying to discover AI critical literacy, but I think we're all on the same journey, so maybe people can join me. And so this is where I am in my journey, I think, is what am I going to do in my classes? I know what it is, I know what it's doing. I've learned a lot, especially last season. But now, like, what do I do with my classes? Because I've got to have like a theoretically a legitimate classes is what I'm shooting for. Maybe even better than legitimate, you know? Let's aim high. And so this focus on academic, the opposite of cheating framing that they use, I think is right where I need to be. I guess the idea of this book is that we would have fair choice, like faculty would be able to make informed choices about these same questions I'm asking. Um, so as you read the introduction to the book, what kind of things came to mind for you as far as what this book should, what we should draw out of this book for people in the Missouri community in teaching?
Well, I really enjoyed the first chapter in which they're talking about why students
Right,
cheat.
right,
It referred to things that resonate with me. So when I make presentations to student groups or occasionally to groups like graduate students on how they might deal with academic integrity in classes for which they're a TA or an instructor, I talk about the sources of academic integrity violations. And one of the things I talk about is that some people, I guess, just want to cheat because they don't believe in the mission of the university. And those people are always going to be with us. There are some number of thieves in the world, and you might want to lock your car because somebody might steal your stuff or steal your car. And in academic integrity, there are some people who are enrolled at the university and don't want to do the work. I don't think anything close to a majority of the students who are referred to my office are in that category.
right.
I have a lot of students who say things to me like, I'm not a cheater. And I say to them, I'm not interested in having a conversation about who they are. I want to have a discussion about what they did. Now, I'm also interested in who they are a little bit because if I think someone is an incorrigible cheater, that might affect how I want to handle their case on behalf of the office of the provost. But in general, I am not here to find out whether someone is a cheater deep in his heart any more than if someone steals my wallet and runs away. I want to find out if he's a thief deep in his heart. That's a reference to Jay Smooth, if you're not familiar with his work. But in any event, when I'm talking to these students, I want to know what happened, why did it happen, what can they tell me? And so often the answer has to do with time pressure, bad time management, and related things, or other stress in the students' lives. So it's 11:40, the assignment is due at 11:59 p.m. on Canvas. They are supposed to write a brief reading response or give their thoughts on a Canvas discussion board about something, and they plagiarize content from Wikipedia, or they ask ChatGPT to analyze the reading for them, and they're able to turn it in on time. Whereas if they had been thinking about it 3 hours earlier, they just would have done the work. And so many of the students are astonished when I ask them, why didn't you ask for an extension or just turn it in late with a note about how you were busy or something like that? And it doesn't occur to many students that they could get an extension. Also, if it's 11:40, they correctly realize the professor is not likely to get back to them by the deadline, so they won't really know. But many students are really nervous about either being embarrassed, like the professor thinking they're bad at the class or don't care about it, so they don't want to turn it in late, or losing points. They're convinced they're going to get a 0 on the assignment. And then if they do the math on that, they might, in retrospect, consider that this Canvas discussion board post is worth maybe 1/1000th of their semester grade in the class, but that wasn't what they were thinking about at the time. And even that 1/1000th might have been given back to them by the professor if they had turned it in good faith with a semi-plausible excuse about how they were busy with their clubs or their family problems or their boyfriend or whatever it might be. And so this issue of time management and other stressors, I see again and again and again. And one of the things I do with my own classes is that for most of my assignments, I don't have any penalty for reasonable lateness. And if it's turned in within a week of when it's turned in, if it's a small participation style assignment, I just give them the points. This is for my large 1,000 level undergraduate class. For law school, it's so different because we're so exam heavy. But for my undergraduate class, I do have some assignments that are more important and I take off points for lateness, but I'm really explicit about how if you email me or the TA for an extension, I'm very likely to give it to you if you haven't been abusing it and so on. And I do that in part to discourage students from thinking that cheating is the best strategy in a difficult situation, because I just don't want to deal with the aftermath of that bad decision making. And I recognize that my particular strategy may not be appropriate for every professor's course, but it was something I have thought about before. So I was glad to see the authors begin with a discussion of what are some of the factors that give rise to cheating, which is similar to what we discuss in the law when people talk about the so-called root causes of crime. And I know that's a cliche, but there are certain factors and situations that are criminogenic. And if you want to fight crime, you might, for example, have more streetlights at night. And that will reduce the likelihood that people will get robbed while walking the streets. If you just say people shouldn't commit crimes and I'm not going to put in streetlights, well, you're making a bad policy decision, in my opinion.
And that's what these authors are saying here. I think some of their opinions could be, if everybody on campus actually were to read this book, some of their opinions could really make some people upset. But I think that that's how they're approaching it is there are things faculty can do in light, especially in light of AI, because there have always been students who are going to cheat for a variety of reasons. But in light of AI, especially, things that faculty can do to protect the integrity of their classes, right? And they started with this in the introduction. They had these 10 principles. So before we'll get right back to chapter 1 here in a minute. But in the introduction, they listed these 10 principles. And I don't know if any of them stood out to you. In my notes, I put 7 out of the 10 in the notes. So I guess I didn't even that's a lot to put in there. And the first one is probably the most interesting, right? Cheating is natural and normal. Did you?
Yeah. A variety of things that are bad are natural and normal.
Yeah. But I think that's that's an eyebrow raiser, right? Like,
people lie, cheat, and steal. It's a natural facet of the human condition. That doesn't mean it's not bad. That doesn't mean it's not blameworthy, but we would be very foolish to think that only really weird, aberrant students are going to violate the rules, whether it's rules about academic integrity, whether it's rules about sexual misconduct, whether it's rules about substance abuse or possession in the dormitories or things of that nature. People break the law. Yeah. Students violate rules.
And then the second one, reassessing like an AI, in the AI era, it says, don't become a police officer. And it encourages us instead to extend our role as educators. So it's saying, instead of wasting all of your time trying to catch the cheaters, I guess it's saying adjust your courses so that they have integrity and you could be more successful teaching rather than wasting your time catching.
I think there is something to that. Naturally, we are going to have to do some things for which cheating is still going to be possible. It's not possible to completely cheat-proof a course, and some amount of policing will be necessary. I recognize that in the regular world outside of the academy, there is a abolish the police movement. That's not a movement that has a significantly large constituency in the United States, even among people who are very suspicious of bad police behavior, in part because sometimes you need the cops. And just like sometimes you need the police, like, for example, when there's been a murder and you want someone to investigate it, or when someone has been sexually assaulted, or when someone's car has been stolen, they might want to report it to somebody, and there has to be some municipal agency who will take that report and perhaps investigate. Similarly, in the academic world, if we're going to certify that our graduates have accomplished certain things, we have to make some effort to police and deter students who will pretend to have done those things without having done them, but police and deter.
Mm-hmm.
And deterrence is often going to be better than policing after the fact.
Yeah, like more educational value to it. I'm pretty confident that my undergraduates were using AI to pass my tests last spring, and I I'm not upset with them, and I don't view them all as cheaters. I think I've got to change my class. Like the way I was using my test, doing my test was not. There's no. I lost the integrity of the test, and that was my fault, not their. Because I didn't explicitly say in the syllabus you can't use AI on the test, and I didn't make it difficult to not use AI on the test.
So those are two different things, I would say. Your failure to instruct the students about whether they could or could not use this new and ubiquitous and free technology, I would agree is your fault. Sorry. I think professors should try to be really clear with students about when these tools are and are not allowed. I think that's in keeping just with good educational practice, but also with the academic integrity rules of the university, which prohibit unauthorized use of artificially generated content, which means the students need to know what's authorized and not authorized. And while sometimes that's obvious, it won't always be obvious. And that's partly why the task force that I had the opportunity to be one of the co-chairs recommended that every professor put in the syllabus, and some of us would have gone even further and said on the instructions for every single assignment, information about when and how AI may be used. I think that's just being fair to the students.
Mm-hmm.
I think your failure to make a test for which using AI would not be helpful, I'm not sure is fair to blame you. There are papers that we assign to students, and your failure to write a paper prompt that a student couldn't hire someone more experienced and smarter to write for them doesn't mean you were too uncreative in writing a paper. People have been hiring other folks to write their papers for them. ChatGPT is available to do it instantly and for free. So that obviously has increased the problem, although whether ChatGPT is as good as hiring a subject matter expert is a separate question. But I don't think professors need to be down on ourselves simply because we want our students to do some things that if they used AI, they could do it quickly and easily. Because there are certain things students need to learn how to do. Calculators are really good at multiplication. That doesn't mean that elementary school students shouldn't learn their times tables and how to do 3 and 2-digit multiplication because they're learning the number sense. It's important for them to have some understanding of what 42 times 68 means besides the answer that comes out of the calculator in response to that question. And so it may be that our professors who teach introductory English composition courses, whether English 1000 or any other kind of class, want students to write things that bots might be pretty good at doing, particularly in the future because the bots are getting better and better. I don't think a world with really good bots is a world in which students should never learn how to write a paragraph. Now, maybe I'm silly and old fashioned, and maybe my attitude toward writing a paragraph would be like a math teacher saying, I want students to manually multiply 40-digit numbers by each other. We would all think that's crazy. That's what a calculator is for. 2 by 3, that's different. 40 by 40, come on. But these are judgment calls. And I think some amount of stuff that generative AI tools can do will nonetheless reasonably be assigned to students. And it should be okay for professors to say, don't use these tools until you learn how to do it. But then we're going to have to engage in some amount of effort, whether that's proctoring a test or having them take it in class. And that's hard too, because now there are hidden tools that can be behind the word processor and behind the Canvas browser. And this technological race is a complicated one, but I don't think we should give up yet on the idea that students should have to learn how to do something that a machine might be pretty good at.
Yeah. And the point, like, I think that this book is And what they're talking about here is part of is they're trying to suggest this is a really good time. I think, at least for me, and I think for a lot of faculty members, this is a really good time to think about how we're going about trying to make sure our students learn and how we assess that learning. And they're trying to suggest that we pull ourselves toward protecting or encouraging an integrity in our courses and then turning AI's challenges of our existing assessments into opportunity to teach instead of an opportunity to police as much as possible. And also there's always going to be criminals. I love that they call them enrolled persons, right? There's always, I love that term. Like I think I've been thinking about it ever since I read it. Like there's always certain people. I have large lecture classes, right? And so I've got 200 plus students. There's always a few that there's absolutely nothing I can do that I will reach them. They are simply an enrolled person. There, and I think those are the folks that are most likely to cheat no matter what we do. And I think it's healthy to accept that. But I still think that I have to create a more educationally and integrity class environment next semester when I go into class.
And I'm with you. I think coming up with assessments that these bots are not good at is a valuable thing for us to be thinking about. But I'll just say that certain amounts of locking your car are also helpful. So we had a class this past spring in which this was another large lecture class in which students were taking exams and they were supposed to take them on their own computers in a large lecture hall in person. And to prevent the students from taking the test elsewhere, the professor displayed a code at the front of the room when the exam opened, and you had to type in the code to begin taking the test. It turns out that some students who were less committed than we would like to academic integrity looked at the code and ran off and took it elsewhere or texted it to friends who were back at off-campus locations and so on. And there were a fair number of students who were cheating. And when some of the students were caught, they said things like, yeah, I think everybody's doing that. And they said things like, why didn't the professor make us show our ID on the way in and the way out like my other professors do? And this was said also by some students who didn't cheat. And they're like, I didn't cheat, but I'm annoyed that other people can cheat so easily because certain cheating prevention measures were not employed in this class. And I'm confident that this professor is going to run his class differently in the future. And that's just a matter of professors learning best practices from one another to decrease the perception that if you don't cheat, you're a sucker. And that was one of the other things these authors identified. And I think if there is a widespread belief that students cheat, it's harder to get our diligent, want to do a good job students to believe that we're all on the same team here in a common educational enterprise.
Right. Like the good students are really trying to see the students who aren't necessarily trying as much succeeding or surpassing them. They're like, well, I have to do this to keep up with my peers. My grade point average is going to be lower. I'm going to have missed opportunities. So yeah, I don't want that to happen either. I want the good students to be encouraged to be good students, not to be encouraged to be bad students.
And we've seen this in other countries with things like taxation. So in the United States, most people just pay their taxes. The IRS doesn't send around a bunch of goons to make you put money in a bag or something like that. And then, of course, there's some amount of auditing. And recently, we've largely defunded the tax police in the United States. And I personally think that's a big mistake. And I use the example of Greece, where it is widely perceived that if you are well off in Greece and you pay your taxes, you're some kind of stupid person, because who would do that when everybody else is avoiding the taxes? And once you have a culture where people think following the rules and doing the so-called right thing is a chump's move, that's a very corrosive and difficult culture to undo. And so I'm pleased that these authors are encouraging educators to get ahead, because if what we do is keep our assignments and our assessments exactly the same for the next decade, and it becomes known that students are cheating all the time and only a couple of weirdos are following the rules because of their weird belief that nobody should ever drive above the speed limit or something like that, that's going to be a big problem.
And so they listed, I think we've already touched on a few of these. We've listed, that was one of them, a few of the why students cheat list, right? What other ones stood out? Because I'm thinking that you're on the end. You get to deal with the disasters, right? Like you get to deal with the classes that aren't the faculty members who didn't do a good job, building the assignments to make them have integrity. You get to deal with the students who are enrolled persons who have no interest in learning, and everything in between. Which of these why students choose to cheat reasons from the chapter stood out to you most that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, I also get to do a little bit of proactive work on
Good.
this front, but not as much as I might like, in part because my position on this campus is not full time. And I'm not saying it should necessarily be a one FTE position, but there are universities that have a full time academic integrity director, and uh, that's not a that's not a choice that this campus has made in terms of the spending of money. And I'm not sure I would want to do it personally. If they asked me, would you leave teaching entirely to become the academic integrity guy? I might say no. But in any event, I have somewhat limited time. But I do try to spend some of it talking to faculty meetings, for example. And one of the things I talk about is if the students believe that the professor cares about them and the students believe that the assignments are worthwhile, they are less likely to cheat. And some of that is within the control of the professor. So you can communicate to the students that you care about them in a variety of ways, some explicit and some implicit. You could literally get up there and say, I care about you. That might seem a little clunky, like when old President Bush said, message I care, reading it off of a piece of paper. But if you say to the students, by the way, you should feel free to come by and see me after class if you're interested in a job related to what we're doing here, because I really care about your future and I always want to learn more about what my students are up to. You might sound a little old fashioned or something, but I think that will resonate with a lot of students. And of course, you could change your assignments to make them more obviously relevant to the students. But even if you're not going to do that, the exact same assignment can seem more relevant to students if the professor says, by the way, let me tell you why I'm asking you to do this. This is going to be really important later in this semester. Or this may not be especially important in this class in a way that's obvious to you, but almost everybody who's taking class X is going to be going into class Y within the major. And in class Y, you're going to need to know how to do this. They're going to presume you know it. And if you don't, you're going to get crushed. You know, if you don't do the stuff in basic chemistry, intermediate chemistry or PChem or Orgo is going to crush you. So let's make sure you understand the valence electrons or whatever it is that we're teaching in this introductory class. And you can tell I'm a lawyer and not a chemist. But in any event, these sorts of things make a big difference. The research suggests that it really affects student behavior. And I think that's important because there are certain things faculty members cannot control, such as the learning objectives of your course might be assigned to you. You might have to deliver certain content, some of which you know the students will find boring, perhaps because it's boring. Now, maybe you can teach in a way that makes it more exciting, but in any event, you may have certain things you don't control. You may not get to control whether you have 550 or 500 students in your class. There are things you could do with 50 people that are really hard to do with 500 in terms of interactive activities. Not that you can't do anything interactive with 500, and there's a variety of good information about the science of teaching that our folks at the Teaching for Learning Center would be happy to talk to you about. But of course, it's more difficult with 500 students than in a seminar to get people engaged in conversation and so on. And so those things may be beyond your control. You can't say to the dean, I want all my classes to be bespoke seminars. It's hard to run a 30,000 student university that way. But you have some control about whether you communicate your interest in the students implicitly and explicitly. You have control in whether you take the extra 30 seconds to explain the purpose of an assignment. You have control about possibly reimagining an assignment so that it is more obviously relevant to the students and of interest to them if you can do so without sacrificing the educational value. And so I think those are nice because it gives agency to the professors who might otherwise be tempted to despair.
I think there is despair. Um, and okay, so what from this list? I think you gave at least three things there that may or may not match with the list, and it doesn't matter. They were all really good points. What does what does their list, these authors list, what was it missing? What was something you said, man, they didn't cover this on the list? Or was it a really complete list?
We're trying to describe human behavior, so a truly complete list is probably unfair to ask, but
Well,
I thought it was a pretty good list.
while you think about it, I mean, because I can't assume everybody who's listening has read it. One of the reasons they said that students cheat is that students don't think they can actually do the work. They don't think they're good enough. I really like that one because my tests are really hard, and I think there is a population. I was like empathizing with each of these a little bit. Like I think there is maybe a population of students who say, "I have to cheat to get through this class. It's a required class." Doesn't make it right, but it helps me to know to think about the possibility that that's happening so I can address it. Um, let's see.
Well, and I would say related to that is the possibility that students literally can't do the work.
Yeah, of course.
So I think the phrase, do they think they can do the work, is maybe us imagining that the students are selling themselves short, that if only we were better at building up their self-esteem and so on, they would know, okay, I can do it, and the professor has my back, and there's tutoring available, and so on. There is occasionally the phenomenon of people who are in courses that they can't pass. And I know we don't like to talk about that, and it's demoralizing, and it's maybe contrary to the idea of a growth mindset. But I think all of us can recognize that there are certain things that we can't do, right? Like Bill Ackman is not going to win that tennis match, no matter how many more opportunities he gets to play professionals. And I'm probably not going to be in the Olympics. And it's not about me having the right attitude. It's about me being who I am at the age I am, with the body I am, and how much work I've done to get myself ready for the Olympics by this time. And are there students who sometimes sign up for a class they shouldn't be in? Yes. Maybe that's an advising failure. Maybe that's because the student wouldn't listen to good advice. I don't know. But we occasionally have students who are in classes they shouldn't be in. There are probably at least some students who go to college who shouldn't be at a serious university. And that's an unpleasant thing to say, but I suspect is true in at least some number of cases.
Yeah, and students get passed on too. So by the time they get to my class, they should be able to do it because they've already gotten through all their all their freshman, sophomore, and possibly junior year of work. And a related one that I thought was worth checking in on was clear expectations. Faculty have not given the clear expectations, so they don't know they're cheating. I think that's an interesting one for me to reflect on too.
I have seen that particularly in the context of plagiarism, where students will do something that you and I would immediately recognize as plagiarism that the students do not. And a good example would be a verbatim quote that is not in quotation marks, but is followed with a footnote and a citation or an in-text citation. And so the student's like, I don't understand. I gave credit right in the very paragraph that the professor is complaining about to the authors. And I have to patiently explain, well, because you didn't use quotation marks, a reader would be reasonable in believing that these were your words expressing an idea that you found in the text that you then cited, as opposed to the precise words of the source, which you copied verbatim without so indicating. And even just saying that out loud, I can tell I'm boring you already because I'm saying such a fairly straightforward thing that people in our line of work are expected to know. But I have definitely met college students who don't know this. And I have to explain to them that if they go to hearing on plagiarism, they are extremely likely to lose. And I'm not trying to throw them out of the university for this mistake, but I do believe they're responsible for an academic integrity violation. And let's see if we can come to an agreement that we all think is a sensible resolution. So that phenomenon exists. But I also think that there's a lot of students who absolutely know they're cheating, and the various other things that the authors talk about, like them rationalizing it or them just being in a headspace where bad decisions are easier to make, which, of course, college students make bad decisions all the time about all sorts of things, like, substance abuse and relationships and so on. And so we shouldn't be surprised that people who are of any age, but particularly people who are the age that university students tend to be, make some number of bad decisions, including important ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that makes my job fun, actually, is I enjoy working with undergraduates because they're sort of discovering the world, but at the same time, they do make questionable decisions.
Look, I'm the
Um,
faculty advisor for a fraternity.
oh my
And
gosh.
one of the values of a fraternity is that it gives students leadership opportunities. And in order for a leadership opportunity to mean something, the students actually have to be able to make decisions about the organization without older advisors watching their every move. But what that sometimes means is alcohol violations and hazing ensue. Well, you can't give students agency and say, why don't you grow into being an adult who's going to be responsible for your own affairs without tolerating some amount of bad decisions. Now, of course, in the fraternity world, that leads to complicated questions about how carefully we ought to be auditing the student events, because if you provide no supervision, you get the tragedies that sometimes make the news. And of course, on this campus is a fairly recent memory of a horrible situation involving a fraternity event gone horrifically wrong. But if we actually said we're going to have 30-year-old plus people at every single student organization event to prevent bad behavior, we would be taking away something of great value from our students. And I think similarly, if we said what we're going to do is create some kind of panopticon so that we can watch every single thing you do as you think about and then perform an assignment for this class, because that's how committed we are to cheating, we would really degrade the educational experience. And I think a nice analogy is none of us would want to live in the kind of country that was so carefully policed that there was absolutely no speeding on the roads and no theft in the stores. Because to literally get us down to zero speeding and zero theft, we would have to be watching people so carefully and or punishing them so severely for infractions that it would be out of some kind of dystopia. So we all tolerate some amount of bad driving because we don't actually want a police officer to follow each individual car. What percentage of Americans should become police officers to make the roads safe? 50% of us? It's probably not a sensible way to run a country.
Right. So I think when I see they didn't know they were cheating listing, I'm thinking, okay, especially with AI, I've got to clarify all my assignment sheets. I mean, there's an extent to where a student could always say, I didn't know. But from my end, I can't control all of that, but I can control the end where I say, I was explicit, I was clear in my assignment sheet. That's something I can control. I can't control every student. I guess that makes sense, right? That one thing we can be doing in the AI era that's affecting how we do our work here at the university is we can clarify our assignment sheets, right?
I think clarifying syllabi, assignment sheets, and in-class verbal communication
Yeah.
is all valuable. We all know that people don't read the syllabus. So it would really be helpful to, on the first or second day of class, say, this is an important thing, and different professors have different policies, and here's my policy. And if your policy is, this stuff is forbidden unless I say otherwise, you should communicate that. If your policy is, this stuff is permitted unless I say otherwise, you should communicate that. If your policy is, my assignments are totally different with respect to AI permissions, so it's very important that for every single assignment you check it carefully, and I'm going to remind you as the semester goes on, then that's what you should communicate as well. Is it, of course, imperfect? Well, yeah, it's human communication. Some people won't listen or understand. But I think if you make an effort, also by explaining why you have a policy, you might increase buy-in with the students and make them more likely to want to follow your policy. I also think the job of professors like you and me would be made a lot easier if we could take for granted that our students had a certain baseline level of knowledge about how these tools work and what they do, which I think is not true right now.
Right.
Our students have tremendously varied levels of competence and knowledge about this. If the university were to roll out a 1,000 level course on intro to AI and I have heard rumors that maybe some good people in engineering are working on
Right.
this. I would want a lot of students to take it, assuming it is as good a class as it ought to be. And will one day a course like this be required of students at every serious university? Maybe. I don't know. But right now, a professor in a 1,000 level law class like I teach, I don't know what my students know about ChatGPT and how good it is at thinking and the risks of hallucinations and so on. And how much of my time do I want to spend teaching that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. And there's definitely a literacy and like how much they used it as previous classes or in high school, or how much technology they had available to them at home, all kinds of things like that. Um, in your role with academic integrity, which is not your full role, but and you just rolled off being an associate dean at the law school. So,
For one more week, I'm still on the
oh, okay,
clock.
one more week, and then I can. It's funny because we congratulate people when they get promoted to positions like that, and then when it's over, you also congratulate them because they're done, right? They're free.
I've served my time in the associate dean suite, or at least on Friday I will have.
I don't think I've ever met an associate dean who didn't look tired. So you're about to maybe not look haggard, but anyway, in your other role with the academic integrity, how has AI changed what you do in that role?
Well, it's led to a lot of cases, of course. So
Influx of cases.
I,
Okay.
I just have cases coming in that didn't used to come in. When there was no such thing as ChatGPT, no one was using it improperly. And now that it exists, I have professors who say this student is obviously using AI to answer my assignments, even though I prohibit it. And I have some cases that are easy and some that are difficult. So I had a student who was asked to write some kind of reflection paper on a course, and the instructor is quite confident that the student used an AI tool to do it, even though it's explicitly prohibited. And the student essentially said, if you think my answers to this question look sort of robotic, that's because it's kind of a dumb assignment, and the rubric was the kind of thing that a robot could answer. I mean, I did it myself, but I just tried to make the professor happy. And I said that the guy's class was great, and here's what I might do to learn more in the future, and so on, and just tried to get the points. I don't know what you're telling me here, and sorry. And I don't know, is the student lying to me? Possibly. Can I prove it? Probably not. And so there are cases that can't be won, or at least that I'm not going to try to win. And I had another case, though, recently in which a student denied using an AI tool. And I just thought it was so obvious that she was not telling me the truth. And we took the case to a hearing, and she was found responsible for a violation. And I think it's too bad that she didn't admit her behavior much earlier in the process. But I get paid money to run this office. And if a student did it and the evidence is strong and they don't want to admit it, that's what hearings are for. And we have a chancellor's committee on student conduct, which is the same committee that hears regular student conduct stuff like drugs in the dorms or whatever. And those folks get training on how to be hearing officials, and a little bit of that training relates to academic integrity. And if I have a case, I notify the Student Accountability Office and they schedule a hearing for me. And so I don't have a ton of hearings per year because the overwhelming bulk of students who have strong evidence against them are promptly admitting their behavior. But we have some. And so the AI cases, though, are often frustrating for faculty because they say, I think the student did it, but I can't prove it, or their evidence turns out to be based on a ChatGPT detector, which is not reliable. And I have to tell them that I don't want to use that evidence because I don't think it's reliable. So what else have you got? And then they explain it to me, and sometimes I'm with them and sometimes I'm not. And sometimes I'm with them in spirit, but not in practice. I say, I think you're may be correct, but unless the student cracks when meeting with me, they might get away with it. But this is not that different than the phenomenon of paper mills, where people used to put up paper advertisements on telephone poles near college campuses that would say, you want someone to write a paper for you, call me up and I'll do it. You know, I have a good record of getting B's and above at serious universities in the following subjects. And this has literally been going on long enough that my favorite retired university administrator, who happens to be my dad, published an article about this kind of contract cheating in 1972 and was involved in a lawsuit in which Boston University, which was his employer at the time, sued some of the companies that were engaged in the papers for hire, and I believe in the state courts of Massachusetts, although I'll admit that even though I'm a law scholar, I have not yet found the court records on this matter. But, that's a half century ago. And my dad didn't discover the concept of cheating. And so this has been going on for quite some time. And ChatGPT is essentially a cheaper, stupider version of those paper mills from the 70s and before, although it may one day become a cheaper, smarter version of those paper mills. And that's going to be a new and differently scary problem.
So if from your end where you're receiving these cases, what can a faculty member do as they're building syllabi, building assignments? What can they do to avoid ending up having to be in your office, end up having to having a student with a potential, like what can they do to try to prevent this type of academic integrity questions? I guess you're listing the previous earlier when we talked about showing that you care about the assignment and the students, that kind of list, making sure to explain why the assignment's worthwhile, that sort of thing. Was that the advice you would give them, or is there additional
I would start with that. I would say, again, communicate to the students that you care about them, which hopefully is actually true. So this is not something you have to pretend. You just have to communicate it and not expect the students to take it for granted. I think communicating the importance of the material to the students, which also I'd like to hope is mostly true, although it will not 100% be true, right? There are certain students who are taking a class in which they have no interest to fulfill a requirement of some kind because they need to get a degree. And these are not all people who I would call enrolled persons like our authors do. These may well be serious, no-nonsense students who happen to take one or two classes for which they are more like the enrolled person stereotype.
Okay. Yeah.
They really care about engineering and not this philosophy class, or they really care about philosophy and not this astronomy class they're taking to satisfy the science requirement or something. And it may be we can communicate to them the importance of the science requirement, but maybe we can't. But some effort to try to communicate the importance of the subject, which in some classes will be easier than others. But if you have students taking organic chemistry, for example, because they need it to be a doctor, but they otherwise don't care about the chemistry, and they're not actually likely to do that much organic chemistry while they're off being a psychiatrist one day after they finish medical school and their residencies and so on, it could be a hard sell. And so I think for some of those courses, it's also helpful to try to create assignments on which it is harder to cheat. I'm not saying it's all the professor's fault, and if the students cheat, it's because you designed an assignment poorly. But I would say there is some relationship between the quality of assignments and the incidence of cheating, and on how easy it is to catch students. And so it might be that you create an assignment in which, of course, students can still cheat, but if they do, it's more likely you'll catch them. And then if you call them on it, they're more likely to admit it because the evidence is strong. And then you're reporting them to my office in a way that goes relatively smoothly and is less likely to lead to I said this, you said that kind of scenarios. So the example I use often is if you tell students to write a plot summary of Hamlet, that is not a particularly creative or interesting assignment. And it may be quite difficult to convince students that this is an assignment that's worthwhile and valuable, even though it is important to be able to read a document and summarize it in a way that's accurate, concise, intelligent, and so on. But there's a lot of summaries of Hamlet already in the wild, and ChatGPT might be able to do a half-decent job pretty quickly, in part because there's so much Hamlet-related material for ChatGPT to be trained upon. And so if you say, why don't you compare this thing in Hamlet to this thing that we did in class, that might be harder for ChatGPT to do. Now, I don't want to overstate, though, how easy it is to ChatGPT proof an assignment, because unless there's no way to feed that other source into a generative AI, it's still possible that the student is going to say, here's this poem the professor had us read in class. Why don't you tell me how it compares to Hamlet? And ChatGPT or Claude or whoever might be pretty good at it and could do it really fast. But some amount, and I know the idea that we should constantly be asking the students to reflect personally, how does Hamlet affect your life? And I'm not sure how much I'm buying into that. I don't think every single assignment should be about the student's own feelings and personal experiences, but coming up with some way in which they're talking about Hamlet in a way that is within their abilities, but is not as seemingly a rote exercise, has some value. But I'm not going to pretend that I've done some audit of the English department. I'm not telling you anything about the quality of the assignments currently being given out at the university. It's really not my area.
You were also, like you mentioned earlier, you were one of the chairs of the AI task force. And I mean, I assume maybe your experience was similar to mine. I was just a lowly member, however, which actually is probably a better place to be. But anyway, I learned a lot. Like I learned so much by being part of that task force. The part of the task force that you led was related to what we're talking about today, basically, right? So what did you learn from your work on the AI task force that would be helpful for people to think about when they think about integrity and assessment in AI?
Well, one of the things I learned on the task force is just how little so many people are thinking about legal issues that AI is presenting. And I like to remind people that I don't have a Missouri law license. And so I'm not your lawyer or the university's lawyer or anything like that. But it is helpful to have some legal training when I was looking at this. And the questions about copyright and about student privacy and all of that, I think we have a ton of colleagues who are not really thinking about how if you feed student work into a large language model, you might be violating student ownership of the intellectual property of these assignments. And you could imagine a certain cynical person saying, give me a break, the student intellectual property in his plot summary of Hamlet or something like that. But students own the rights to what they write just as much as faculty own the rights to what we write, absent special rules to the contrary. And issues about privacy, and this is very complicated. And people at, say, the medical school have given this a lot of thought because they're thinking all the time about patient records and privacy and things like that. But people in a lot of other departments have not. And so I wasn't surprised to learn that a ton of my colleagues are dumping student work into AI detectors without thinking for a second about whether there are potential legal ramifications, not especially likely to cause you problems, legal ramifications, but still having a culture where we follow the rules and try to get these things right is important. I think a lot of faculty, at least at the time we were on this task force, had made close to zero effort to communicate explicitly with students about AI related expectations. And many of that, much of that phenomenon, I think resulted from faculty taking for granted that the students knew that that was cheating. And so that I think does feed into the author's do they even know they're cheating question. And of course, the further you go back in time, the more plausible it is that students had no idea if something was or wasn't allowed. And as we're going forward, I think we're going to start to see expectations become somewhat well settled, where for example, forgetting about AI, that if you have your roommate write your paper for you and turn it in, that's prohibited, even if the professor doesn't explicitly say you need to write the papers that are assigned for this class. And so I think having an AI tool write the paper for you completely and turning it in, I think students know they shouldn't be doing that. But the more we tell them that and the more we're clear about what's allowed and what's not and why, the better we are going to be on this. And so that was a big part of what I was learning. I was also just learning a lot more about the capabilities of the tools themselves, in part from colleagues of ours on the task force who are using it a lot more than I have. I've played around with them because I think part of my job is being familiar with these tools, but I don't really use them, for example, for my legal research or for my own writing or for my lesson planning. But hearing that there are faculty who are using it to create all sorts of rubrics and stuff like that, I thought that was pretty interesting, and helped reinforce why no one should ever use this attitude by faculty will not be taken seriously by students. that students know that in the workplace, they may well be asked to use this stuff. And so there's something really weird about an educational environment in which we all pretend that these tools don't exist. On the other hand, in a lot of workplaces, turning in AI generated garbage would be a good way to get fired. Although perhaps not in as many workplaces as I would hope, right? And we saw recent documents related to vaccinations that were put out by the government of the United States that seemed very clearly to involve AI generated material. And I'm not sure that anybody suffered workplace discipline, much less firing for it. And this relates to the broader question of the ethical environment in which our students live. The more that there's a perception in the country that only suckers follow the rules, that crime pays, that dishonesty is the move of a smart person, it's going to be hard for any university to combat that culture. The more we have a culture in which people believe in education for its own sake and believe that a grade should be earned instead of stolen and so on, the easier it is for individual faculty to run our classes. So we receive the students that we receive in the country in which we live, and those are things over which we have very little control.
All right. Yeah, and I think it's been my focus is so much on my own teaching is because I can't control that. You're right. I'm going to have 210 strangers show up in my class next month, and all I can do is control, what we're talking about. My syllabus, my assignment sheets, my passion for what I'm teaching, my reasoning for why I'm teaching the class. I can't control if that, despite all of our efforts, they still cheat. I tried. That's all I can do. Any last thoughts before I let you get on with all of your various important roles? Your last week as associate dean.
There you go. It's like in those gangster movies where somebody has one last job or something like that.
One last job, one last hit on AI.
Yeah. First of all, I'm glad to have been introduced to this book, which maybe I would have discovered without your help, but maybe not. So, and I will admit I've only read the introduction in chapter 1, and so I'm looking forward to seeing more of it because some of the chapters are, at least to me, exciting opportunities, and we'll see if they deliver. But I'm cautiously optimistic because I like the introduction in chapter 1, and I think we're going to need to continue to do a ton of professional development for our faculty. And this is one of those things where we're saying to our colleagues, congratulations, here's some new stuff that you didn't train on to become a professor, unless they became a professor last week or something. And now you're expected to know this stuff to be any good at your job. And that's not that weird. That happens, right? When the internet came to be a popular tool, faculty who didn't grow up using the internet nonetheless had to learn it. And none of us would take seriously any professor who said, well, I didn't use email when I was in graduate school, so I'm not going to use it today. That's just not sensible. On the other hand, it would be silly for the university to expect professors to find a 25th hour in the day in which we can all become AI experts without taking away anything from the things we already do at work or in our free time. And so I think the more that we as departments, schools and colleges, and the campus as a whole can make it as easy as possible for professors to learn this stuff, to be trained in best practices, to get updates on the latest in the technology, the more we can incentivize people to learn. And I'm not one of those guys who says that professors should get a little payment like the rat pushing the lever every time we do a nice thing. Every time I meet with a student, I get a candy bar from the provost or something like that. I mean, that's not a way to run the university. People should do things based on our inherent self-respect and professionalism. But just like we can make it an environment in which students are more likely to believe in the mission and engage in integrity exhibiting behavior, similarly, we can make it easier for faculty to learn this stuff, easier for them to be trained on the latest materials, easier for them to have their courses and assignments evaluated by peers in a timely and constructive manner. The more we do that as a campus, the better results we're going to see. And the more we say, boy, I hope every professor buys and reads this book and all on his own devotes extra uncompensated time to responding to this extremely frustrating phenomenon, the less likely we are to be an institution in which all of us are happy to work.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Sure. Thanks for having me.